In the dense canopy of the southern lowlands, where the air once hung heavy with moisture and the calls of howler monkeys echoed through endless green, something began to shift so slowly that no living person could have named it. The rains that had fed the great cities for centuries arrived later each season, thinner, more hesitant. Rivers that had carved deep channels through limestone sank into their beds. The soil, worked generation after generation to feed swelling populations, grew lighter in the hand, more reluctant to yield. At first, the change felt like ordinary hardship, the kind every farmer had known. Yet beneath the surface of daily life, a quieter pressure was gathering, one that would not announce itself with fire or invasion, but with the steady withdrawal of the very conditions that had made civilization possible. No one understood what was coming next. For centuries, the classic Maya cities of the southern lowlands had risen in careful balance with their landscape. Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and dozens of lesser centers stood as monuments to human ingenuity amid a tropical environment that demanded constant negotiation. Reservoirs captured the seasonal rains. Raised fields and terraces stretched productivity across thin soils. Trade networks carried salt, obsidian, and cacao across hundreds of kilometers. Kings performed rituals that bound the people to the cycles of rain and maize. In the plazas, the sound of grinding stones mixed with the murmur of markets and the distant thunder of afternoon storms. Life was never easy, yet it was ordered, predictable enough that populations grew and monumental architecture climbed ever higher into the sky. The forest pressed close against the edges of the cleared land, a living reminder of both abundance and limit. Daily existence before the stress became visible followed rhythms older than the cities themselves. At dawn, women walked to the reservoirs with clay jars balanced on their heads, while men moved into the milpas with digging sticks. Children learned the signs of the seasons from the flowering of particular trees and the return of migratory birds. In the evenings, families gathered around hearths where maize was soaked and ground, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and cooked beans. Ball courts filled with the sharp crack of the rubber ball and the shouts of spectators. Scribes recorded the deeds of rulers on limestone stelae, binding human time to the movements of the stars. The cities felt permanent. The forest felt inexhaustible. The rains, though sometimes delayed, always returned. The first warning signs arrived as small irregularities that could still be explained away. A dry season stretched a few weeks longer than memory allowed. A reservoir that had never failed dropped lower than the oldest elders could recall. Certain maize varieties that had thrived for generations produced smaller ears. Hunters reported that game animals had moved farther into the remaining forest. These were the kinds of troubles every generation faced and overcame through extra labor, new clearings, or intensified ritual. No one yet spoke of a pattern. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, in the gradual mismatch between what the land could still give and what a growing population continued to demand. As the decades passed, the irregularities multiplied. Tree ring and lake sediment records later recovered by modern science would show that a series of multi-year droughts began to settle over the region like a slow eclipse. Rainfall declined not in a single catastrophic year but in successive seasons of scarcity. The great reservoirs, engineered with remarkable skill, could no longer refill to previous levels. Farmers expanded their fields farther into steeper slopes and thinner soils, accelerating erosion. Deforestation, already underway to supply fuel and construction timber, removed the very vegetation that had once helped retain moisture and stabilize the ground. Each adaptive measure solved an immediate need while quietly deepening the underlying vulnerability. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late for simple remedies. Political and social systems that had once managed scarcity began to strain under the new conditions. Rulers, whose legitimacy rested partly on their ability to mediate with the rain gods, found their rituals unanswered. Rival cities that had competed for prestige and captives now competed for dwindling water and productive land. Trade routes that had carried surplus maize and prestige goods grew less reliable as agricultural yields fell. Monumental building projects, once symbols of power and continuity, required ever greater amounts of labor and timber at the very moment when both were becoming scarcer. The pressure was not only environmental, it was institutional. Decisions that had worked under earlier climatic regimes now amplified the stress rather than relieving it. Inside the cities, the texture of ordinary life began to change. The sound of the grinding stone grew more insistent as households worked harder for smaller returns. Children who once played freely near the reservoirs were kept closer as water levels dropped and disputes over access increased. The smell of smoke from household fires mixed with the sharper odor of dry vegetation. In the plazas, the crowds thinned on market days. Some families quietly abandoned outlying settlements and moved toward the larger centers in hope of protection or more reliable water. Others slipped away into the remaining forest, seeking places where the rains still fell with something closer to the old abundance. The social fabric that had held the cities together was stretching. The system began to fail, not in a single dramatic moment, but through a cascade of interconnected breakdowns. Agricultural shortfalls reduced the surplus that supported specialists, artisans, and the royal courts. Reduced surplus weakened the ability of rulers to reward loyalty or maintain public works. Weakened authority made it harder to organize the collective labor needed to maintain reservoirs or defend against rivals. Conflict increased. Some centers saw violent ends. Others simply emptied as people walked away. The great stelae that had once proclaimed eternal dynasties ceased to be carved. The ball courts fell silent. The reservoirs, no longer maintained, silted and cracked. What had been a living urban landscape began to return, slowly and unevenly, to forest. Human consequences unfolded across generations. Families that had lived for centuries in the same valleys scattered. Knowledge of specialized crafts and calendrical systems was carried by fewer and fewer people. Malnutrition left its mark in the bones of the young and the old. The dense populations that had once filled the southern lowlands thinned dramatically. Some northern centers continued for a time, adapting to different ecological conditions, but the classic urban fluorescence of the south was gone. The silence that settled over the abandoned plazas was not the silence of sudden catastrophe. It was the silence of a long withdrawal, of people who had finally accepted that the land could no longer sustain the world their ancestors had built. Across the centuries that followed, the forest reclaimed the stone cities. Trees rooted in the plazas. Vines covered the temples. The reservoirs became still ponds or dry basins. Later travelers would walk among the ruins and wonder at the scale of what had been lost, often attributing the emptiness to conquest or mysterious disappearance. Only much later would the evidence of prolonged drought, soil exhaustion, and the compounding effects of human pressure on a fragile environment come into clearer focus. The Maya collapse was not unique in kind. It was one chapter in a longer human story in which environmental stress has repeatedly tested the resilience of complex societies. Similar patterns appear in other places and times. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloan communities of the Colorado Plateau faced multi-decadal droughts that undermined the agricultural base of their great houses and cliff dwellings. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire confronted a shift toward more arid conditions that stressed irrigation systems already operating near their limits. On Easter Island, the progressive clearing of forest cover altered the island's hydrology and soil stability, compounding the pressures of isolation and population. In each case, the environmental signal was not the sole cause, yet it acted as a persistent force that narrowed the range of successful responses and amplified existing social and political tensions. What unites these episodes is the way stress accumulated below the threshold of immediate recognition. Societies adapted, innovated, and intensified their efforts, often succeeding for a time. Yet the cumulative effect of reduced rainfall, degraded soils, diminished forests, and rising demographic pressure eventually exceeded the capacity of existing institutions to manage. The warning signs were visible in retrospect: declining crop yields, lengthening dry seasons, increased competition for resources, and the gradual abandonment of marginal lands. At the time, they were experienced as discrete hardships rather than as symptoms of a systemic shift. The collapse did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as the point at which the sum of earlier choices and external pressures made continuity impossible. The long-term historical impact of these environmental collapses reaches beyond the ruins themselves. They remind later generations that complex societies are not independent of the ecological foundations that support them. They show how tightly political legitimacy, economic surplus, and social cohesion can be bound to the reliability of rain, soil, and forest. They illustrate that technological and organizational sophistication can both buffer against stress and, under certain conditions, intensify it by enabling larger populations and more ambitious extraction. The abandoned cities stand as silent evidence that the relationship between human systems and environmental systems is never permanently settled. In the end, the story returns to the quiet places where the process began. A reservoir that once reflected the sky now holds only dust. A plaza that once rang with voices lies under a canopy of secondary growth. The heat of the dry season presses down on stone that no longer serves living hands. The forest has returned, patient and indifferent. What remains is the record, written in sediments and tree rings, and the bones of those who lived through the long decline, of a civilization that flourished within the limits of its environment until those limits themselves began to move. The collapse was not sudden. It was the final expression of stresses that had been gathering, almost unnoticed, for generations. And in that gathering lies a pattern that has repeated, with variations, across the long arc of human history.